Holly, I am going to turn to you. I'm going to ask you to tell a little bit about yourself and kind of your story as to why did you get involved, how did you get involved in this school choice movement?
Sure. So thank you all so much for coming to the Conservative Party Conference, and I also want to thank Assemblywoman Marjorie Burns, who sponsored this particular session. I am a mother of 4 children. I am a former public school teacher, and I guess after the last panel, I'm a recovering college professor. I have a unique background. I'm able to teach, really, I've taught children mathematics from the age of preschool through professional engineers at Procter & Gamble. And I now am a librarian, and I teach U.S. citizenship classes to immigrants. So I really have a broad and unique perspective on education. And I'm, during the pandemic, my eyes were very open to what was happening in our schools. And I was able to find a private school where my children now currently go that really fits our family and our values much better than the public school was able to do. I live in an urban area. I am a city dweller, and I was a proponent of the public schools. I thought, as a former public school teacher, my husband was a public school teacher. I come from a family of public school. I was in the union. I was in the national union. I thought that I would be sending my children to public school, and I would be exercising the school choice program that we have within our city limits. And when my children were they couldn't get into the school that we had chosen for them for whatever reason, test, or it was only half day and I was working full time, or for a variety of reasons. And then my only option was to send them to the assigned district school that in the city is consistently for decades has been performing below state averages on reading and mathematics. I knew that wasn't going to work for my family. So we were able to work with a private school in my neighborhood, and that's, I work for them now as a librarian part-time, and I'm able to be with my children. They love it. And I'm just, there are great options other than the public school system. There are great public schools in the state of New York, and that's a great first choice. But if it's not working for whatever reason for you and your family, there are other choices, including homeschooling and those kinds of things. So I just wanted to educate, take time today, maybe if you had questions about later on after Emily and Jason speak, about other things that are going on nationwide in terms of other schooling options for you and your family, and the freedom to choose, other ways to educate your kids.
Yeah, the fact that you arrived where you're at during this pandemic experience is not unique. In fact, the Times Union recently ran an article talking about the increase in the rate of homeschoolers, and those that are leaving public education and moving to homeschooling is one of the options we can talk about today. And I believe the figure was cited was 58,000 homeschool students now. And so that number just continues to grow, and I think was accelerated by the pandemic. So you're not unique in that.
Yeah, and it's maintained. It's staying. People are staying homeschooling. They're realizing the freedom that they have within the homeschooling movement, and parents need to be supported in choosing homeschooling. And so curriculum choices or things like that. So I'm just a fan of all of the wonderful parents that are taking education back into their own hands and putting them on a path, a better path.
And Emily, your story is a little different, but tell us your story, how you get involved in this movement and where you're at today.
So my name is Emily DiVertola. I'm the new Education Policy Analyst at the Empire Center for Public Policy. I arrived to the Empire Center and to New York sort of fresh off of my master's program. I studied global comparative education policy and pedagogy over in the UK at Ulster University in Northern Ireland. So basically, I just looked at what works for the top performing countries around the world, how much money are they spending, what curriculum choices are they making, and what are their results. I did my thesis on high stakes testing, and that's how I ended up here, but really my passion for this comes from my own schooling background. I'm a proud alumni of a traditional grassroots K-12 charter school back home in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was not as friendly to school choice back then as it is now, so my school faced a lot of challenges to open up. We didn't receive facilities funding, and I still remember a couple weeks before the start of school, we weren't sure if we were gonna have a building at all, and I remember my parents, among many other parents, literally painting the walls of my kindergarten classroom and clearing off the blacktop that we used for recess. So that's where my passion for this really comes from. At that school, 90% of the kids were on free and reduced lunch program. A lot of them were kicked out of their local public schools and didn't really have anywhere else to go. But they graduated from that school having all registered to vote and having been accepted to at least one college or career pathway program. So, I know the power of school choice for the families that really need it the most. So yeah, that's how I ended up here.
Excellent. Emily, I'm going to turn to you first then. Can you help us to understand from the high level what education, where it stands in New York? And specifically, I'm thinking about the governor's budget. I mean, can you talk to us about what we spend per student in New York? And it looks like about a 10% increase in this budget is proposed. If you can just tell us kind of where those numbers are at and get a better idea of what kind of return on investment are we getting here in New York?
Sure. So in terms of per pupil cost to educate, if you look globally among all of the OECD participating countries, the average cost to educate one student is approximately $10,000. Our national average here in the United States is approximately $13,000, and New York spends over $25,000, which is 90% higher than the national average, and some districts spend much more than that. This year, school aid will increase by about 10%. And if you look back over time, in the past decade, since 2012, school aid has actually increased 76%. In that same time period, New York has not managed to reach the national public average score on the nation's report card assessment, for example. Just this year alone, on New York State's own state assessments, less than half of students are proficient in any area. Approximately 45% are proficient in reading, and only about 35% are proficient in math. And the achievement gaps are even greater for ethnic minority students and students on the Economic Need Index. So I think New York really proves year over year that simply increasing spending on education does not automatically yield better results. And even more notably, during that same time period, public school enrollment has been steadily declining. So schools are actually receiving more money to educate less students. And the reason for that is because parents are seeing the writing on the wall and they're pulling their kids out of the public schools, and they're paying out of pocket for tuition at a private school or transportation to a charter school, homeschooling, tutoring, whatever it is, while their tax dollars are still flowing at increasing rates to the schools that they have pulled their kids out of. And a lot of parents don't have extra money to pay out of pocket. They can't afford both taxes and tuition. So that's why school choice is so important.
And can you address the charter school situation? I know that's also an issue that's being discussed in the legislature right now. Talk to me about where charter schools are in New York, the number of schools we have, and what could happen this year.
Sure. So charter schools are really the main version of school choice that exists in New York. New York is pretty behind in terms of school choice programs, but they do have charter schools. They cap the number of charter schools that are allowed in the state, particularly in New York City, where there's the greatest need for more choice outside of the public school system. The charter schools in New York City serve approximately 13% of the public school students in the city, 80% of which are economically disadvantaged, 20% have IEPs. So charter schools do serve the students who really need adequate and safe schools the most. But the state limits the growth on charter schools due to the cap. Most recently, there is a proposal to lift the regional cap on New York City charter schools, which would free up 100 more spaces for charter schools to open. There are an estimated 50,000 students on charter school wait lists, so it's great news for them. There are many schools that have been trying to open but have been limited by the cap, so it's great news for them too. But it is being met with some opposition from political interest groups who would like to see the money continue to flow to the district schools in full.
And Holly, you mentioned you've kind of been through the gamut of some of the different educational options. What differences have you seen, in your kids and your family as you've looked at those different things? What have been the benefits? And I assume they're benefits because you're there. Where have the benefits been in the choices you've made?
Sure.
Sure. So my children go to a Montessori school. So they are in mixed age groups. My daughter is not is 8 years old, but she's in a classroom with 6, 7, and 8-year-olds. Next year she'll go into a classroom with 9, 10, 11-year-olds, and she already reads at an 11-year-old level. So the flexibility that the teachers have within the system to put her into an age group with a smaller class size is she's reading at a really advanced level. One other benefit, my son, having been a public school teacher, boys have a hard time sitting in seats for a very long time. In the Montessori school where my children go, they are allowed to move freely throughout the classroom, and he is active all day long. He's up out of his seat. He's so focused on getting his work done for that particular day. My kindergartner is outside for recess, probably over an hour every single day, and the amount of outside time that they get for, and like I said, we live in an urban city. I'm an urban dweller. They are bused to a local like meadow. We call it. It's like a land center, and they have once a week an hour of just outdoor time to discover nature and do science lessons outside in nature, any weather, and they become they're acclimated to the weather where we live. So there's a lot of benefits to being able to choose a school that aligns with your family values. They don't teach everything, and of course, as a parent, no matter what school they were in, you would have to supplement. If they were in private school or a public school, it's my responsibility as the parent to fill in the gaps that they're not getting, and of course, I do that in various ways through volunteer work and playing the Pledge of Allegiance on repeat, in my car to make sure they know that, because that's not taught in their school. But it's having the parental right and in taking care of my own children to have the ability to put them in a school that is really the right fit for them and my family has been very eye-opening. So I hope that answers your question, Jason. Yeah.
If you look at educational options on kind of like just a spectrum, when you think about public schools, I think it has the least flexibility for students. I mean, you come in and the classroom is designed a certain way, class sizes are a certain way, state mandates are a certain way, that education runs a certain direction. And if there's a student in that classroom that doesn't fit that mold, then it's going to be more challenging. And frankly, every student's different. So the one-size-fit-all approach, I don't think is as effective as we would like to, or I should say those who advocate very strongly for increases in public education would have us to believe. And then you move to the charter school movement, which are still, they're privately run public schools, really, right? They're publicly funded, but they're private. And you have greater flexibility there. There's still some regulations, there's oversight, there are other things that have to apply there, but you have greater flexibility. When you get into the private school movement, which, I'm the chairman of a school board back home on a private school, we still have to realize we live in community. So there are certain things you have to work within certain parameters and boxes. Maybe we're not as flexible as the homeschooling option. But as you go through that spectrum, you'll find there's greater flexibility for your students and your families. And I'll tell you, in our background, our family's history of being involved as a homeschooling family for a season, and then in private education, and I was a public school student, and just all of those experiences, I can just see how the flexibility has been so important to our family's health and how we balance those things. From the charter school perspective, a question came in, can you talk about some of the opposition to that, Emily? Because this is the big, the big gorilla in the room right now is charter schools, what we're gonna do with that, right? And where's the opposition coming from, and how real is it? And let's prognosticate. What do we think is gonna happen? Prognosticate, yeah, I never taught English. Let's prognosticate, never mind what I said. And tell me what you think is gonna happen.
So I will say I'm still coming to learn the labor politics in New York. It seems like the opposition is mostly coming from teachers' unions. And what they're saying about charter schools are really the most common, what I call myths about charter schools. Some of them are going as far as to call them a cancer on public education. I saw that on Twitter. Some really harsh words towards charter schools, but really the myths that they bring up most often is that charter schools first siphon resources from public schools. This is logically incorrect. If you understand that when a student leaves a school, they are no longer utilizing resources, and in fact, those schools are still receiving the local and federal dollars for each student that leaves. So schools are actually making money when a student leaves to go to any school, whether it's a charter school, private school, homeschool. So that's the first myth. Also worthy of note that charter schools receive much less per pupil than the district public schools. They don't receive facilities funding, so charter schools have to do more with less, and they are outpacing in terms of achievement their public school peers. So one of the myths that they circulate. Another one is that they don't serve high-need students, but I just rattled off some statistics about the charter schools in New York City alone. They do serve high-need students. Some say charter schools are selective. Not true. Charter schools in New York admit students based off random lottery. They do not have to pay tuition. And that charter schools are unsuccessful. Not all charter schools are created equally. Charter schools are held to higher standards in terms of performance and accountability than public schools. So if a charter school is not meeting standards, it will be closed. The same cannot be said for the district schools. So those are the common circulated sort of points that are used to deter more charter schools from opening. None of them are true. So
Let's look back then, just a national overview. What's happening in other states in the school choice movement? I know we've seen recent action. I mean, Arizona not too long ago, the new governor there may roll some of that back. I don't think she's a big school choice proponent as her predecessor was. And there's other states. Iowa recently had some action. Let's talk about some things happening in other states in the school choice movement.
Sure. Just 2 weeks ago on School Choice Week, both Iowa and Pennsylvania passed some school choice related bills. In Pennsylvania, they expanded their scholarship tax credit program, which provides scholarships to low-income families to send their students to private schools. In Iowa, they passed an education savings account bill, which gives families partial access to their education tax dollars to be used at any school of their choice. So those are the two most recent ones. In Arizona, they have what some people have called the gold standard of school choice, where all families, regardless of income, can access their education dollars and direct them to any school of their choice. Is there anything I'm missing?
Texas and Florida too. West Virginia has the Hope Scholarship. So anybody can take their tax money and take it to the school of their choice to help with tuition. So
I don't know how versed you are on this issue, so I'll raise it, and if you're not, I'll speak to it. But are you seeing any action regarding allowing some kind of a help for homeschool families, a tax deduction or tax credit, or anything along those lines, possibly being considered in New York for homeschool families or private schools families?
Well, for what I know of is that New York has 2 scholarship tax credit granting programs, but those would go to tuition for private schools. I am not familiar with anything that specifically targets homeschooling families.
not in New York State,
Yeah,
no, Jason, just in other states.
There's legislation that's been introduced that would offer homeschool credits for their families, kind of a tax deduction, but it never gets any traction. To be perfectly frank, it's introduced by a Republican in a Democratic supermajority, and the teachers' unions just kill it every time it comes up. Any movement towards school choice, no matter how small it is destroyed in New York by the teachers' unions and the Democratic supermajorities. So if I can say that any heavier, I would, because I don't care how small the issue is, they allow nothing towards the school choice movement, and that's kind of where we're at. So with that, cheerful news, Emily, what's some of the low-hanging fruit? I mean, what could we do in New York? Let's start legislatively, then maybe we'll talk about some broader non-legislative solutions, but legislatively, what's some low-hanging fruit? What could we do to try to improve school choice in the Empire State?
Could get rid of the charter cap, kind of an easy one. If there are any, ambitious districts that might be willing to try out a voucher program, I think that would be a good place to start, maybe just targeting the low-income families that would otherwise not be able to access school choice. So yeah, maybe a small district-level voucher program, see how it goes, show the rest of the state that it's possible. I think that might be a good step forward. Expanding those scholarship tax credit programs that already exist, maybe making them statewide available or district available. Do you have any thoughts, Holly?
No, I think the small voucher program would be a great start.
I think
Yeah.
we would all love to see, something like an education savings account here in New York, but I've heard that that is decades away. So yeah, I'd be happy to see one district with a voucher program or something like that to get it started.
Believe it or not, we came close under Governor Andrew Cuomo on the ESAs, very, very close. And then the football got moved away. Thank you very much, Lucy. And once again, we missed out on that. But it came close one time, and we'll see what will happen in the future. Okay, can you discuss the cons, the pros and the cons, well, I guess the cons is what this one says, of using property taxes to fund education? Is there a better way to fund education than using real property taxation? Any thoughts on that?
I haven't seen it done.
Yeah.
And it's a good question because that's the reason for a lot of the inequities in public education is that we say this all the time, the families that can afford it have been enjoying school choice for decades because they can afford to live in a zip code that has good public schools. So that's a great question because that really gets to the root of the problem. I've heard some talk about maybe redistricting. But yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe there is a way to untie it from property tax altogether. So whoever raised that question, thank you. I'll be thinking about that.
All right. Let's get into it a little bit here. What do you feel about the mask or vaccine mandates? And let me speak from the private school perspective, all right? The private school that I'm at, we've gone back and forth on how we handle this because in private schools, as I mentioned earlier, you're in a community. And we found that in our community, there were people that were looking at the COVID pandemic. There were some people that were very fearful and wanted us to go all the way over here. And there were people that were also all the way over here and didn't want to wear masks, didn't want any requirements or anything at all, didn't know why we didn't just have COVID parties and all hang out together. So there's different perspectives and how you handle that. Within our private school community, we're trying to handle how to balance that, work that through together. And I think community is a key word when you're working in any kind of a situation like these schools that we're talking about. Because in our case, we're a private Christian school, and so we have students participating from 60 different churches. And let me just say that if you think politics is rough, welcome to the rough and tumble world of church politics, all right? People don't always agree on things. And so we had to navigate some of those things. So our school took the position that we were not under the state mandates because we were not going to be regulated by, in that sense, by the state. In this case, we were a ministry of our church, and so we took that stance. However, we said, here's what we'll do. When the students rode the school buses, by state mandate, they had to wear the masks. When they came into the building, if they were in hallways or common areas, they masked in the hallways, but seated at their desks all day long. They did not have to wear their masks. Most of the day, they remained unmasked, is how we handled it. We also feel that the vaccine mandate would be just a great encroachment on why those parents have chosen private education for their students. We're not public schools, we are private, and I'll oppose a public school mandate, but I'm sure going to oppose the private school mandate should that come up. And so we took a position that we will not do that and prepared to go to court over those things should they need to be. And I think that there's great room within the private school community, and frankly, there is room that is often not used because every time a state mandate comes down, a principal who maybe doesn't always live in this world of wonkish public policy sees this statement from Department of Health or sees a statement that goes out to every public school and assumes that they have to do everything that the public school does. So it really is important that we are cheerfully advocating in our private schools with even our own administrators, reminding them that you are a private school, you have different options. Now, for sake of community, you may have to do things that every parent's going to appreciate, but at the same time, you have a lot more freedom than many will realize in those types of settings. So that's what I would say regarding that issue.
Can I speak to that too? So in our school, because it's so small and every parent gets to participate, we have direct access to the head of admissions and the head of the dean of students. And so it was an actual conversation among the parents, and it was not at the will of the teachers union whether or not our kids were going to wear a mask and whether or not they'd be in school. We were open the entire pandemic. We were open. My kids were in school safely. Nobody got sick. And it was not at the will of another person or a particular interest group or an unjust policy. It was the will of the people who owned that school, and their children were going there. And that is, the power that choice and school choice brings back to education. So, so I'm a big fan of school choice.
Yeah, just last thing from my perspective on that is when you think of the private school setting, the school only survives when the customer is satisfied, right? And so those tuition dollars leave that place if they're not. So we did a lot of surveys. We did a lot of those, find out where parents, where they stand, what do they think about this issue. And we kind of knew where our community was going to be in that issue anyways, but it provided you with what you needed to demonstrate, no, our community is here. So there's principles we're going to stand by, but then there's also helpful to have all of that data to say, you know what, and 86% of our parents agree with us in this position, that kind of thing. So it really helps then when maybe there is someone who doesn't always agree with that position to be able to say, here's the data, this is where we're at, and it just helped us out so much. More general question came up. Emily, can you tell us, just explain what an education savings account is and why New York should have them? Just a general question.
Okay, so an education savings account is an amount of money from the state. The state allots a certain amount of money per child, and then depending on whether or not your student has a disability or is an English language learner, that amount goes up and up. But the base amount that Emily was referring to before, that $8,000 in other states, follows the child to the school that they want to go to. So you take your $8,000 and you can put it towards your homeschooling resources, you can put it towards your private education. If you are able to educate your child at a cost less than that $8,000, you get to save that money for the next year or put it into a college savings account. So the education savings accounts really allow the flexibility and the choice, I think, that so many of us crave as parents in a more resilient education system where you, as the parent, have more ownership of where your tax dollars are being spent and what they are being spent on.
Yeah. So a question came up regarding CRT, DEI, mandatory comprehensive sex ed, are education issues that are driving parents out of public education. Can you speak to these issues and how they impact mandated charter school curriculum? So what kind of things do you find in charter school settings for some of those issues?
So generally speaking, charter schools are held to the same state standards for curriculum and assessment as everywhere else in New York. So they will be taking the same state assessments as their public school peers. They will be guided by the same curriculum, but the way that they administer the curriculum is where some of the flexibility comes in. So you would see, presumably, some charter schools adopting some of those same standards because charter schools are public schools. So they do have to align in terms of curriculum and assessment to the public schools.
Yeah, and they also, I'll just say that there's different rationales behind the leadership in some of the charter schools, right? And so there are some charter schools that will more closely align with some of those agenda items than others will, where there's a lot of private faith-based schools would have a version to those things. One, they don't fall under those mandates, and then they also, based on principle, wouldn't do some of the things proposed in that. But that's where charter schools are a little different. And so, I'll think about the Rochester experience, and there are schools there that are on board with a lot of the things were brought up in that question, but there are other places where maybe not so much. And so that's, again, some flexibility, but the parents get to be responsible for knowing the philosophy and what's driving the agenda in that particular charter school in this case, or even a private school.
An interesting thing in Arizona that's happening that now has the ESA program is the public charter schools have a faith-based component in them. So they are opening religious-based charter schools in Arizona in urban neighborhoods where children have been typically underperforming, and they are excellent schools, and they are there to help urban, the low-income urban kids really escape the cycles of poverty and really liberate them from those cycles. So impoverished cities and faith-based schools, of course, have an excellent reputation of educating, as certain demographics, and they just do so well. And so they should be given the opportunity to do so, and ESAs will, in Arizona, are allowing them to do that.
Yeah, one of the, we've looked at what's the low-hanging fruit and how we can maybe try to advance some things in New York, but there's a lot of threats that are out there too to school choice and particularly private education. I think, for example, if you're familiar with the Dignity for All Students Act that passed some years ago now, it was designed to be an anti-bullying curriculum. At least that's how it was sold, as an anti-bullying curriculum. I know just having lobbying the legislature, we warned them about how that would be used, and sure enough, it's been used to mean something entirely different than what it was kind of sold to the legislature on. But really, the Dignity for All Students Act has now put in special protections, if you will, for students experiencing same-sex attraction, or maybe they're uncertain of their sexuality or their gender identity, some of those issues. And if you are not positively affirming that questioning or that position or any of those things, then all of a sudden you are now deemed to be somehow a threat and bullying that student because you're not positively affirming. Do you see the difference? Tolerance means something entirely different today. And so that Dignity for All Students Act that now is applicable in public schools across the state and is now being used to justify things like, yes, male and female students have to be housed together when they travel on sporting events, or yes, these students, the female and male students are allowed to play in the same team, share the locker rooms and restrooms. Under Dignity for All Students Act, how dare we infringe upon the rights of that one individual who questions their gender identity at the sake of all the other girls who maybe have to share that locker room, right? That is now looked at. There's an effort to push that into private schools across New York. So there is legislation in that would expand the Dignity for All Students Act to private schools throughout the state. Now, at this point, there hasn't been a lot of traction on it, but you can see that it isn't just what can we grab positively in the low-hanging fruit, but on the other side of the coin, there are those that are saying we're not going far enough, we want to constrain private schools even further, and here's how we can do it. And so there have been a lot of little things we're starting to see, more and more mandates that are being applicable, placed to those private school settings, and I think that's going to increase in the years to come. And it's going to require us to be very vigilant in those issues because all of those little crumbs, they impact your school choice options until you don't have the choice anymore. And some of this, frankly, is going to have to be challenged in court as well. And private schools are going to have the spine and the tenacity to stand up and do some of these things because overlords in Albany are not going to back down from these things. They're going to have to be challenged on that. Does that make sense? So that's where we're at. Hey, all right, let's look and see what other some questions we have here as we progress. Is there a minimum student size for charter school, 100 or 200? What's your critical mass for a K-8 or K-12 school?
I don't think there's a particular number, but you do have to sort of justify the need for a charter school as part of the application process. So you do have to demonstrate that there are a large enough pool of students interested to fund your building or whatever other operational costs you're seeking. So there isn't a minimum number, but you do have to show to your district that there are enough people interested to at least cover the costs that it will take you to run the school. Same can't be said for the district schools, again.
Can we talk about some non-legislative solutions for education? Like realizing we're in New York and we can all understand together that we're going to be in a very challenging environment, getting anything done legislatively, the threats are out there. What can we do that we don't have to worry about Albany, that we can accomplish something in school choice independent of the legislature? Some ideas for that?
Homeschool.
Yeah. I would say that's probably the lowest of the hanging fruit right now is homeschooling. I know sometimes New York gets a bad rap. People say it can be restrictive in homeschool regulations. I personally, at least in my district, did not find them. I know it's a district by district. Some are much more aggressive than others. But in my district, we had very minimal concerns in working with our district. We submitted our curriculum by the year, our plan, our IHIP, and put that in. And so it was not bad at all. I am encouraging even churches that are empty most of the week with extra classroom space. Why could they not start a school in that facility or allow someone to come in and start a school? If you're in a homeschool environment, there are often co-ops that meet in church buildings, right? But even more than that, could we not actually formally start schools? Many of the private schools, parochial or in kind of the evangelical world in which I live in, they were started by schools or by churches. And so why could we not have more churches starting schools and using that Sunday school classroom space and those gyms and the stuff that sits empty all week for more educational options in our state. And on that point, it doesn't have to be done by a single church. In fact, I would suggest that a number of entities get together and jointly work on that, because there is work involved in starting a school, but it's not so overwhelming that it can't be done. Where there are committed parents who want to make a difference, it can happen, and you don't need the legislature to do that. There's no cap on starting private schools. And so where there is an educational desert out there, where you don't have school choice options, you can actively think about, what can we do to start a school, a private school in this region? There's a movement out there now being defined as micro schools. And you're seeing more and more of this, to where there are people that are actually even taking RVs and buses, and they're transforming them into classroom space. And they literally drive around from town to town, usually for homeschoolers or co-ops, and then they have the science lab or whatever it is on the bus or on the RV. And so if we think creatively about education, there's some amazing things that we can do if we stop looking to Albany for all the solutions and realize that, as Holly has said in your opening remarks, it is the responsibility of the parents to educate their child. We can't just pawn that off on public ed. It is the responsibility of the parents. And when you get involved parents, you got a lot of creative things that can happen. All right. A couple more here. All right. Is it true New York doesn't have a sex ed mandate that parents can opt out if they're notified and schools are exempt from obscenity laws, which allow schools to distribute pornographic material? Okay, so in regard to that question, and I'll address that. I know, probably, and forgive me, but my organization lobbies against the mandate for public sex ed in New York. We currently do not have a statewide mandate for sex ed, and we're no longer talking about the birds and the bees, by the way, right? And so we're talking about so many other things that fall under this idea of sex ed today. The graphic material that is being brought into schools today is incredible, and it is disturbing to see what is being brought in under the mantra or under the ideology of this sex ed. And so we oppose that. Now, I am in some ways shocked that New York does not yet have a statewide mandate for sex ed, because frankly, a lot of states do. Thankfully, New York does not, but that does not mean that it isn't occurring in your district. So district by district, it's handled differently. Oftentimes, you'll find organizations like Planned Parenthood that will come in and provide a sex ed curriculum for that local district. That's why it's so important that we have people that are still involved in public ed. Sometimes people want to walk away from public ed because they say, well, my kids aren't there, or I'm giving up, I'm throwing in the towel. And I remind them that there are still a whole lot more kids in public ed that are not. So we shouldn't abandon that. That's why I do believe in running for school board. What's a little challenging, though, is oftentimes we'll have someone who wants to run for school board, and they'll be the one school board member that has a certain set of values against 5, 6, 7, or whatever that don't. Well, you're setting yourself up for a mission of failure, all right? And I don't want to see us throw ourselves upon the sword for nothing. So if you are interested in running for school board, one, get some training. My organization operates a campaign school every year where we train candidates how to run for this and get involved. Second, I want to encourage you to think about running as teams for school board. And if you can find 4 or 5 individuals that will run, and then 3 of them get the seat, you now have a block. And you can work with that. So 3 can do a whole lot more in a school board than 1 can. So think very strategically, if you're going to walk into this area, as to how to run and what to do so that you can actually have success in each of those areas. All right? Any thoughts on that?
I would completely agree with that.
All right.
And on the last point you made, definitely the power is with the parents when it comes to creating waves for school choice. When you look at how it was accomplished in other states, it usually did start with parents at their school board meetings or at their legislature's offices and fighting for what their individual kids need as a collective group. So there's power in numbers for school boards and power in numbers when it comes to parents pushing for school choice. So I agree on all accounts there.
And just beyond, if you're in the public schools, you can just ask questions. What's in the curriculum? They have to open their playbook and show you everything that's there. And you can, you don't have to be mean. You don't have to go to a school board meeting and yell at anybody. You can just ask questions. And they'll open the playbook and show you everything. They have to show you it's public. everything that's in there. So I encourage you also to get involved by looking at what's in the curriculum, whether or not you have children and are concerned about what the children are being taught. I always joke, if any of you have ever watched The Simpsons, I'm Helen Lovejoy. Won't somebody think of the children? Won't somebody think of the children? So, even if you don't have your own, or they're grown, or they're out of school, you can always just call up the school board and ask them. So it's that easy to be involved. You don't have to run. So.
And like so much of life, if we start those relationships and now rather than when you have a problem, it's much easier if you're building relationships with your school board members, with your principals, with your administrators, with your teachers now, not when you have a problem, right? So if you're already there and you're volunteering as a parent, or you're involved, you're attending meetings or whatever it might be, if you're showing that you are supportive of the work they're trying to do, it goes far better that when a problem does arise, you already have that relationship. So let me encourage you to think about doing that as well, as getting involved in your local schools or educational options, whatever you're looking at, in that capacity, all right? All right, last question, and then we'll let these ladies go. Did you see a bump in enrollment due to the church-linked schools' relaxed response to the pandemic? And I'll say, not a bump per se, minimal. We saw some, but it was more we held our own. In the Finger Lakes region of New York State, we're seeing just the enrollment rate is plummeting in public education. So from my perspective, when I see so many people leaving the state, fleeing the state, when I watch the enrollment rate of these public schools plummeting in my region, the fact that we've held our own or gained some single-digit increases actually tells me that we're doing far better than public ed. So it wasn't like we picked up 50 students or anything like that, some, but it was, you held your own and added a few, maybe a dozen students, and that has certainly helped the school as well. So, yep. All right, well, thank you so much.